Ooh, a hushed silence. Thank you very much, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you're suitably refreshed. So we are now going to continue the conversation with a session focusing on, I suppose, the pros and cons of industrial strategy and whether we need more of an industrial strategy approach for tech. Now, if anybody was paying attention this morning, you may have noticed that techUK quite likes a plan, and we like to put forward recommendations to government, and we talk a lot about trying to join up different aspects of government policy. But it's some time since we've been talking about an industrial strategy sort of here in the UK. I think we sort of go back to sort of 2017. And actually the world has changed quite a lot since then. In a couple of ways. We've been through Brexit, we've been through a global pandemic, we've seen the very real impact of a major conflict in Europe, and we've also entered into an age of AI where suddenly around the world governments are seeing tech in a much more strategic way, in a much more geopolitical way, as they start to think about, well, what are the sovereign capabilities that we need to have, within our control? And then, of course, there is just the very fact that because tech touches sort of every aspect of the economy, it does rather play to the need to join things up and have some sort of strategic approach. Anyway, that is going to be the sort of subject that we're going to be talking about through the course of the next panel. And I'm delighted we've got a fantastic panel of guests to take us through that. We've got Allan Nixon, who's head of science and technology at Onward, the think tank. We've got Nicola Smith, who's head of rights, international social and economic departments at the TUC, Trade Unions Congress. We've got Olivia O'Sullivan, who's director of UK in the World programme at Chatham House. And we've got Asif Moghal, who's Director for Market and Industry Development at Autodesk, and one of the very kind sponsors of the session today. So I wanted to sort of, begin by, well, I know we prepared lots of questions, but I wanted to just sort of start at, in terms of that analysis I sort of set out, look, the world has changed. I suppose the other big thing that we've seen happen is, in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the impact that has apparently had on the US economy. And I just wanted to get a sense of, to understand your perspectives across the panel. What's your intuitive feel about an industrial strategy? Is it a good thing, or are we better off leaving things much more to the market and having a much more kind of federated approach? Allan, I want to go to you first.
Yeah, sure. So I guess first thing to say is that the government's been on a bit of a journey for the past 10, 12 years where the strategy of old had been pretty laissez-faire from like the 80s onwards, where we'd basically just sort of set up science and tech incentives in a certain way and let certain technologies grow, and that's both in terms of research and in terms of commercialization of that research as well. And I guess since about 2012, I think it was, with David Willetts, he came forward with his 8 great technologies. Then a few years later, we had the 7 technology families of the innovation strategy. We had the integrated review in 2021, talk about how important specific technologies were to prosperity and security. And now we've got the 5 priority technologies. And I think it's quite important to underline that, this has been sort of a long time coming. It's not just from the past couple of years, but certainly what's happened the past couple of years, where we've seen just how transformative some technologies, like AI, but not just AI, are going to be, not just in terms of how much they're going to reshape our economies, but also the national security implications. And we've seen things that are happening right now. China, for instance, are hoarding certain types of information which they can't decrypt right now, but if they get to the point where they can have a scalable quantum computer, the implications of that could be massive, and countries falling behind on that. We are a massive leader in quantum computing here. If we fall back and don't make the most of our strengths in these, we will not only have prosperity issues, massive security issues as well, which I know other panelists here will want to talk about too. So I think important to get that we have been on a journey. We've seen some really positives that the government has done, especially recently with the creation of the science department folded around these 5 priority technologies. But there's lots more to do, and we should probably get into that at some point.
Allan, you took us through the list of the various kind of initiatives. All of them had a number attached to them, 7, 5. You'll notice that techUK also had 7 priorities today, sticking with the plan. But to what extent have those various initiatives been sort of being consistent, and have they built on each other? Have they reinforced each other, or have they sort of taken us off in different directions?
There's been certainly some consistency, but the fact that the list keeps changing, and especially when you're not in AI or quantum or synthetic biology, engineering biology, there seem to be the sort of 3 that come up again and again, and rightly so, I think. But I think for some who are in other parts, so like robotics or things like that, where you'll have parts of industry who will be like, okay, the government cares about me, and then 2 years later, okay, wait, did they not? So that changing the list frequently does have certain signals to industry which I think are unhelpful if they keep chopping and changing. And it's something that we wrote about in our paper that I co-authored over the summer, where we talked about the importance of delivering in science and technology, the importance of consistency and coordination across government, but that lack of consistency has been quite endemic in the UK system in recent years. I think we've had, not just with science and technology, but we've had, I think, 5 or 6 different kind of economic strategies in the past decades. China's had one, right? And there's lots of things, not to follow the Chinese system, but that level of consistency has a lot of merit to it.
Nicola, does that, do you worry about that lack of consistency and from a TUC perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we have very long advocated for a proper industrial strategy across the UK, and I think starting from where you were, when you look at the 1980s, that provides, to our mind, strong evidence as to why you need active industrial strategy, because when you have mass industrial change happening very quickly and government doesn't give thought to its own ambitions for how that change might be managed or to how the workforce will be treated during that sort of period, we see what happens. We see the mass deindustrialisations across the north of England that leave us still with the problems that the current Conservative government can't address through levelling up 30, 40 years further onwards. And that's a very good example of a transition which was handled extremely badly, and where the failure of industrial strategy left communities decimated for generations. So I think we've got a very good example of what not to do from that time period. But I think from your list, you missed, of course, Peter Mandelson's conversion to industrial strategy at the end of the last Labour government. And going right back to sort of first principles, what is industrial strategy? This is continual hackneyed debate, and it's been going on for like decades. For those of us like me who are a bit long in the tooth and been working in this social policy area for too long, you can remember sitting on panels over a number of years arguing about whether government should be picking winners or not, about whether it makes sense for government to intervene in the economy. And I would like to think we are now past the point of thinking that anybody's really of the view that it's the government's job to sit around and say that one, and I'll give them a load of money. But we can hopefully move forward, whatever happens in the next Parliament, to a shared understanding that there is absolutely a role for government in setting out a strategic vision for the economy and recognising that its actions, whether that is through its own capital investment, whether that's through the regulatory framework that it sets for the workforce and for businesses, or whether it's the action that it takes in terms of how the rewards of that growth are shared, has a role in shaping where the economy goes. And absolutely at the TUC we would like to see a cross-government industrial strategy aimed at creating more better jobs, aimed at ensuring the rewards of growth are more fairly shared, ensuring that the benefits of a voice for people at work as part of shaping the direction of our economy bring real productivity gains. So big picture, yes, we need government to recognise that it has a role and that it can have impact, and then we need to see the action to underpin that consistently in a way that will give everyone the certainty they need, but will crucially allow us to improve people's lives rather than, and help us shift on from this period that we are still in of a continual rising level of uncertainty and insecurity at work, and falling living standards for decades. A good industrial strategy is part of the solution to some of the challenges that people are facing across the country. And I think for tech, a crucial role in making sure that the productivity gains that we need can be achieved, but also ensuring that they are shared with the workforce.
I want to come back to the whole question of purpose in terms of what a strategy is sort of trying to achieve. But Asif, I wondered if I could come to you in terms of sort of what's the experience been of business over the last sort of 10 years or so in terms of working with government in a sort of strategic way, thinking through kind of the extent to which government can really support businesses as they try to innovate in particular areas or something. What's it felt like from the business side in terms of this sort of period that we've been through?
Yeah, so I was having a really interesting conversation with quite a few of our customers in the sort of run up to this event, just to kind of get their input. And I think their experience has been mixed. I think if you were a very large organisation, some of the things that have happened in terms of industrial policy have been very welcomed, because they point at big tech, big organisations, empowering organisations to do more R&D, which they can then commercialise. But there's a whole segment of our industry, which is the SME, SMB base, which makes up more than 95% of I think, almost the global economy. And if you talk to people in that sector, they have felt there's been a level of inconsistency. They need a clear message of where we're going in this country with our industrial policy. So as an example, just randomly, are we setting ourselves up to be the centre of design, sustainable design, manufacturing and innovation globally? So something like that. Something that the SME, SMBs can get their head around and plan their businesses around. So from their point of view, it's been pretty inconsistent. It's been a very bumpy ride. And of course, there's announcements that have been made last week and at several points throughout the last few years. Financial incentives that are, of course, very welcome. But the feedback is that a bunch of financial incentives is not an industrial strategy. And that's what they feel that we're missing, and we really need to address that moving forward.
So can you expand a bit on that a little bit in terms of how an industrial strategy approach can better support one of those companies that you're talking about? How does it actually have an impact on what they do day to day, or what they might achieve over a 3-year period or so?
Okay, so I recognise it's incredibly difficult to get something right that everybody will be happy, okay? But as an example, a lot of the companies that we work with are what you'd call sort of small to medium-sized enterprises, so 500 to 600 employees, largely UK-based. What they see is funding is a part of it, but funding isn't the only thing that an industrial policy needs. But a lot of the funding that is available is targeted towards early-stage R&D. A lot of these small to medium-sized companies do R&D, but it's nowhere near the level of some of the more advanced companies we're lucky enough to have in the UK. And what they're saying is that, what about funding to commercialise some of the not as exciting innovations that we've developed? They could be product innovations, process innovations, business model transformation innovations. What about some help to commercialise some of these innovations to help us, grow our way out of this, out of the sort of turbulent times that we've been in? The other thing I hear a lot is, and I think it's a really interesting observation, and this is maybe where a policy could come in, is we're starting to see lots of small to medium-sized organisations start to collaborate with each other, develop new products, processes, almost acting as if they were a large organisation. But then they come to a point in terms of, well, who owns the IP? If we do commercialise the IP, who owns it? Is there a policy that could be put together to help small to medium-sized companies connect, collaborate, innovate, commercialise, but have all of the sort of like the headache of the legal IP protection, that kind of stuff, limited? And that's an example of where a policy could come in. Because it's not all about money. And to be really fair to a lot of the customers I've spoken to, they're not looking for handouts, but they are looking for a clear message from our policymakers to say, this is where we're going in the UK. And looking at the screen here, do we need an industrial strategy for tech? Or do we need an industrial strategy that takes tech into account? And I think the answer is the latter.
Thank you. That's a great segue into my next question, because Olivia, I wanted to come back to this purpose question in terms of, so we talk about industrial strategy, but actually what is this? What are this strategy or these potential strategies trying to achieve? Because there's the sort of economic case of you trying to grow a part of the economy, or there's this broader kind of geopolitical case, which I talked about earlier. Do we have sufficient clarity on kind of what these strategies are supposed to achieve, and what are the different sort of options that are ahead of us?
No, I don't think we do have sufficient clarity over what we would want to achieve with an industrial strategy, and I think that is going to be a question the UK will really need to grapple with. So you raised the example of the US's Inflation Reduction Act. Certainly not the only game in town in terms of industrial strategy, and one of the reasons I think the UK, I sort of agree with the general thrust of the panel that we do need something like this, is we're not where others are. We're in danger of falling behind. So obviously there's the Inflation Reduction Act, but there's also the EU's CHIPS Act. It's invested a lot of subsidy in semiconductors. The EU's taking other approaches. We saw some research at Chatham House from an organisation called Global Trade Alert, which found if you add up all the corporate subsidies linked to industrial policy, which have been announced just since the beginning of 2023, it amounts to $1.7 trillion. So lots of countries are engaging in a more active industrial policy. The issue is, for what purpose? If you are the US, you can afford a massive package like the Inflation Reduction Act, which has several goals: green transition, investing in green tech, securing jobs, onshoring industries. Some of that's for political reasons, securing votes and securing supports in particular parts of the US. But also that's about geostrategic competition with China. And some of the other measures the US has taken has been explicitly to try to get ahead of China in certain critical industries. We are not the US. We don't have the world's reserve currency. The next government, whoever they may be, will have very, very narrow fiscal space to invest. So I think, much as we might wish it weren't so, we will have to make some very careful choices about where we allocate resources. And the tricky thing is, are we pursuing an industrial strategy for the purposes of prosperity, which is, I think if you're doing that, you really seek to maximize your capacities. You look at areas where you already have an advantage and you run with the ball, you invest with them. But if you're worried about the national security side, you perhaps look at your riskiest dependencies and you seek to minimize those. And I do think those are different things. And we're going to have to make some careful choices about which ones we're going for. It's not that you can't combine the two sometimes in some areas of critical tech, but we're going to have to think also about working with other countries and partners. We're not going to onshore large portions of the semiconductor supply chain to the UK, right? Which is, the government, to be fair to them, is not seeking to do that. It's sought to identify areas where we are strong in semiconductors and invest in those. But we're going to need to make some careful choices, and I think we are going to need to be a bit clearer about the purpose of this.
Because it seems to me that often when we have these conversations around industrial strategy, we tend to throw everything in. We make every possible business case for having an industrial strategy. So we throw in the economic, we throw in the social, we throw in the geopolitical, and we sort of want this kind of overarching approach that will fix all of these problems and give us all these benefits. But you're saying, well, I suppose my question is, does one size sort of address all of those things, or are there real trade-offs here that you have to make? And have we even started to have that conversation about that? Realizing that no, we've actually got to really decide what it is we want to achieve here. Because you're sort of saying you don't think we have had that discussion.
I'm not sure we have. I think if you look at something like the UK's experience with Huawei, there was a discussion a few years ago, as many people will remember, about whether Huawei should be a part of the UK's 5G digital infrastructure. And it was very controversial, and eventually a decision was taken that we should not have Huawei as part of our infrastructure, or we should remove Huawei from our infrastructure, because there was kind of very broad, long-run concerns about the security risks of relying on China for a specific part of technological infrastructure. That is a very different, and one way you might seek to reduce instances like that is to invest in not necessarily your own technological base, but make sure that you have enough of a diversified supply chain that you're not in a position where your only option is a Chinese company in that instance, or a supply chain or a technology from a country that for whatever reason you have concerns about being dependent on in the long run. Those are very different questions from how do we provide jobs in the Northeast. I'm not saying you couldn't, with some very careful and strategic investment, maybe address both in some cases. I'm just sort of underlining that we're not necessarily in a position to do Bidenomics here, where you sort of seek to solve all of those problems at once. So, sorry to be the pessimistic one on the panel.
Nicola, is that bad news? That no Bidenomics for us?
Look, we're not an economy of the size of the US, but I think there's really positive lessons you can learn from the Biden program in the US. I mean, we have seen clear evidence that government capital investment crowds in private sector investment. I think that takes that argument on its head. It keeps going round and round and round, that, you know, government capital can drive the space for more private sector money to come in, number one. Two, we've seen government using its purchasing power to drive improvements in employment standards in a way that hasn't been as mainstream across, certainly across America for quite some time. So, you know, very many of those businesses who have benefited from direct government investment have not only gone on to grow their business, but they've done so with union recognition agreements, with improvements in workplace terms and conditions, and with improvements in the lives of their workforce and their families as a result. So I think there's a lot that can be learned there in terms of the supply chain implications that government spending can have, and ways that procurement can be used for public and for social good in a way that hasn't been part of political debate in this country over the last 14 years particularly. And in terms of this question of like how wide does your industrial strategy go and what does it do? I mean, you know, it becomes, you know, sometimes these discussions are sort of tiresome, right? Because it feels like you can just include every single microeconomic policy in the world, and you get panels of people going, oh yeah, skills, oh yeah, you know, capital investment, oh yeah, we've got to think about procurement rules and IP, and it's true, but what we're sort of flailing around talking about is, you know, the lack of a structure that allows that discussion to happen, and then allows everybody to come to a shared understanding of what the ambition is, and then crucially sort of get on with it. And I think, you know, what we would really like to see is, you know, government sets out its overall vision for where it would like the economy to go. I've been pretty clear about what the TUC would like that to look like. And then you think about, together with the workforce and with business, you know, what does that mean the priorities actually look like, and how together do we use our collective power to achieve those? And if you can get that sort of agreement on the direction you're going in, you are much more likely to be successful. You will have your workforce on side, making the case inside these businesses for the investment to come to the UK. You will have government showing across its different agencies, look, our skills policy is lined up with our industrial objective for this battery plant here, where we have got money to spend, we are going to direct it towards this ambition in this way, and you start to move forward and you see results. And I think that is what we are lacking, and the reason these discussions can feel so sort of draining is because we haven't even got those basic frameworks set up, but we know from other countries when you do, you can have real impact. So I think that's what it's worth keeping hold of.
Allan, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, no, so I agree that definitely that government incentivising through its own spending to crowd in private investment is very, very important, especially on R&D, which we don't see enough of with our big corporates doing in terms of R&D, and government has a really important role to play in that. On the sort of this industrial strategy point, and when people talk about government investment, one thing I would point out is lots of people automatically think that you're meaning subsidies, and people, that's where their mind goes to, and subsidies are really, really expensive. And obviously we have to be cognizant of the economic situation that we're in, the sort of fiscal firepower that the government has, given the headwinds that it has faced in recent years. And I mean, the economist Danny Roderick has made this point before, where he analysed different industrial strategies from different countries over the years, and the ones that were actually more effective weren't the ones that had these big subsidies, and yes, they can be helpful, but actually the ones that were more effective over time were the ones that invested in things like public goods, such as, so, you know, we're talking about trying to boost the commercialisation of research that's happening, government's investment into infrastructure that helps to bring together academia, private sector, and public sector funding from other kinds as well. That's the sort of stuff that we need to see a lot more of, rather than, and it's also much cheaper as well, which is Danny Roderick's main point too, which, given the current environment, is very, very important for us to be thinking about. And the broader point again, which I think you were touching on, Asif, was just the government's overall coordination is just as important as fiscal firepower, and not to downplay the importance of that, but the signals to industry, which has been mentioned previously, is really important. That's where regulation is important, and all the other sort of public goods and the levers that government can pull. Pulling that as one, not just across Whitehall, but even with its regulators, and trying to be a bit more lined up, because we've seen quite a lot of examples of when government and, I would say, Whitehall and the regulators have not necessarily been all that strategically aligned, I would argue. Government being more aligned overall in terms of the signals that it's sending to industry is really, really important. We've not been nearly good enough. Some good signs, but there's so much more to do, I think.
Asif, yeah, I mean, I'm curious in terms of, from your perspective, so in a constrained world, there's going to be huge constraints on government spending for the next government. Where would you like to see the next government really kind of focusing in, from a tech sector perspective, from a tech company perspective?
I mean, there's so many great points made, which I could dive into, but to answer your specific question, I think that an industrial strategy, or we'll call it an industrial policy or industrial roadmap, whatever it is, I think it needs to serve as an enabler for growth and prosperity. That could be a great starting point. The previous policies that we've seen focused in very aggressively on productivity. There's nothing wrong with productivity, but there will come a point where you're so productive that there's no more you can take off your bottom line. We're a long way from that yet. So productivity on its own, we just don't think it's a road to growth and prosperity. What we need is something to focus equally on opportunity creation and value add. So where would we like to see the industrial strategy focus? Definitely to the SME, SMB sector. There's so many of them. Imagine boosting the GDP of that sector of the market by 10 or 15%, because they're starting at a very low point. But that would have a massive impact, which would be felt a lot sooner. We would like to see a focus on digital collaboration by bringing some of these small to medium-sized companies together so they can collaborate together, they can work, they can innovate, they can brainstorm however it is they want to work, and then commercializing that innovation. Those are some of the areas that I think we would love to see. But the other observation I've had, we were involved, maybe like many of you, were involved in some of those round tables at the precursor to the Made Smarter review. Everything was about advanced manufacturing. And to your point, are we really going to compete with some of these global players who literally are the manufacturing houses of the world? And I feel that we're missing a big sector of the UK, which is our ability to design and our ability to innovate. So what I'd like to see in a policy is the bringing together of design and manufacturing as a single connected discipline, because you can't make something that hasn't been designed. We've got some great strength of design and innovation and creativity in this country we should be leveraging. Perhaps we could compete on that level in a way that maybe some of our global competitors can't. So I'd like to see a reframing of our thinking from advanced manufacturing, because that's what we hear all about, to advanced design and manufacturing as a single connected discipline. I'd like to see some way of bringing people together to collaborate more digitally. And yes, there's this whole question about bringing 5G out to everybody and making sure even a small manufacturing company in the middle of nowhere is as connected as somebody in the city. Policies to help people innovate, collaborate, and commercialize IP. Those are some of the things that we'd like to see. But then there is a thing around skills, and I keep hearing we have a skills problem. And we did some experiments a couple of years ago where we just took a second-year student from an engineering university and we placed them inside a manufacturing business for 2 weeks and said, fix something. And you'd be astounded at what they fixed. 90% productivity boosts. I mean, the future is in bringing together education and industry in a way. And I'd love to see some sort of policy where, I mean, certainly we didn't charge for it. It didn't cost our customers anything other than paying that student for 2 weeks worth of time. But the net result to the company, amazing. And in most cases, those students were hired by that company after they finished their degree. So there's lots of quick wins that we could invest in to really drive, to catapult ourselves out of the gates forward, because we can't afford to wait any longer.
Well, that's really interesting, though. But I mean, the challenge there is you're sort of asking people to rethink what the UK economy is good at, or what it can be, what its specialisation can be in the future. When often what happens when we start talking about industrial strategies is sort of all the established interests get together and say, okay, well, what can your industrial strategy do for me? And then we get this sort of very, very fragmented approach. Now, obviously, Labour have set out their approach to government, which is this very missions-based approach, which feels to me like a way of getting around that point of, you know, everybody sort of bidding for their bit. But do you think that missions-based approach addresses what Asif was saying, which is we've got to find a way as a country to work out what our specialisation is going to be in this global economy going forward? Is there a sense of is there enough discussion about that? Does there need to be more discussion about that?
I mean, I think the benefit of the missions-based approach is that it gives you an overall ambition for the economy in terms of seeing GDP per capita going up, in terms of seeing living standards rise and the number of good jobs created increasing. That gives you an overall ambition for what the role of government is. I think when you get into this, I really found it interesting what you were saying, Asif, because it made, you know, my locus in this debate is to think about how do we make sure that wherever the innovation comes from and wherever the specialism and the tech development might be, it is for the benefit of people at work, and that those benefits are shared. And the red alarm bells that went in my head when I heard your example was, oh, that's great, someone's come into a manufacturing company and running 90% productivity. Well, you know, at what cost? If that's been done in a great way that's going to increase the profit of that company and keep everybody's job safe and secure and provide lots of opportunity for new employment into the future, fabulous. But we also know from you know, the green transition, for example, that you've often got choices about how you go about these changes. And you know, you can decarbonise a steel plant, for example, by shutting it down, or you can find a way to transition it to low carbon steel in a way that protects jobs and the local economy at the same time. And I worry that we are, because the pace of change in this area is so fast, our regulatory framework and our thought about how we make sure we are actively choosing, insofar as we're able to, how we manage the transition hasn't yet happened and hasn't caught up. And you know, this probably isn't the place for me to deliver a lecture about the TU's views on AI regulation, but we think there needs to be a framework that ensures that people are, where AI is being used in their workplace, you know, enabled to continue to exercise their employment rights and the fair and decent treatment they need, but more crucially, that where there are changes happening in businesses as a result of tech adoption, that thought is being given across the wider economy to where jobs are lost, what that might mean for the people who are affected, and where new opportunities might be created, or to how change can be managed in such a way as to be as jobs rich as possible. And we know, going back to Biden, that can be done. We know from looking at, you know, green transitions in other countries where government has chosen active sectors to invest in, partly because of the jobs gains that it can deliver. So I think making sure that is part of a central part of the discussion around tech changes is really crucial.
Can I come? So I couldn't agree more in terms of we're not talking about the replacement of the human species in the arena of work, but an observation that we have around the small to medium-sized organisations is the perception of where they are with their digital adoption is nowhere related to where they really are. And so we heard a lot of feedback when the whole sort of Industry 4 conversation were happening. A lot of our customers were joking and saying to me, I'm not even Industry 2 yet. And so some of the things that we were coming out with were way beyond where they are. So adoption of, now we're talking some very basic digital technologies. We're not even talking AI or anything yet, but just some basic digital best practices could take this powerhouse growth engine we have in the UK and catapult it forward. And we could use that as a springboard to go further and further forward. So that's the other recognition that I think we need to have, is that the SME, SMB sector, there are some brilliant shining stars out there, but there are not that many of them. How do we make that the normal in terms of that sector? So I think if we could just, in the examples of using the students, all they did was go into the organisation and just observe and say, you could save time by doing it this way, you could save time by doing it that way. And as a result, the organisation was able to do more with the people they had, as opposed to replacing people. So I couldn't agree more. And that's what we mean by opportunity creation and value add. It's not just value add to the bottom line. It's opportunity for the company, the customers they serve, the people they employ. Value add could be the triple bottom line, people, profit, planets. You need to think about it in that respect, I think, not just, and this is why I've got a bit of a problem with just productivity only, because productivity only is a race to the bottom line.
Olivia, I wanted to come back to the international experience, and I suppose the question about, we've talked about various other economies and jurisdictions who've been implementing sort of various forms of industrial policy for various purposes. What do you think the UK can learn from that, and what would you be advocating for in terms of what the UK should be bringing back in terms of setting out its own approach?
I think that I certainly share the panel's emphasis on setting out some very clear goals and priorities. I think we can not only learn from other countries, but we could actually be thinking more about active partnerships with other countries, particularly on these aspects of an industrial strategy that would be addressing high-risk dependencies, fragile supply chains. As a lot of people have said, it's not like the UK is going to onshore all of these industries. It's not like we can reduce supply chain risks by kind of doing that. And to be clear, I'm not advocating that it's either security or prosperity, just that we need to be clear which tools are for which, and clear what the UK has the capacity to do. Things like supply chain disruption affect jobs, affect prosperity, that kind of thing. So we can kind of combine these goals, but I think there's interesting ways that we can think about how do we diversify our supply chains and how do we build partnerships with other countries. So if you look at the UK's AUKUS Pact, which is the pact we have with the US and Australia to develop nuclear submarines together, a kind of lesser commented aspect on that, there's a second pillar of it, which is about cooperating together on critical technologies, critical technology development. I think that's really interesting. That's, those kinds of partnerships where we are saying we as the UK are not going to kind of own all of this, but we are thinking about ways we can work with allies to diversify our access to critical technologies, share developments. That's a really interesting approach, and I think that's kind of missing sometimes from this conversation, is how do we work with other countries? How do we work with other countries to power the green transition? The EU and the US have their Trade and Technology Council where they talk about some of these risks, talk about their strategic approach to technology development. The UK being in forums like that and doing more to partner with other countries, I think is definitely something we should sort of a string to the boat that we should add to this industrial strategy discussion.
Allan, can I come to you on, it's a very complicated world that we're trying to build some kind of industrial strategy approach for. We've heard about the multiple different kind of objectives that you could be trying to achieve. And obviously there's the challenge of trying to get kind of coordination across different bits of government. And then you've got the sheer sort of chaotic nature of the world and external pressures and events that happen. How does, potentially a new party in power or a new government, how do you actually even go about the process of developing that kind of strategy? Because it requires an awful lot of coordination, an awful lot of kind of collective thinking, and yet government doesn't really work like that, does it? It's just a lot more frenetic and disjointed and random.
Yeah, the report that I mentioned earlier that I co-authored over the summer, I wrote that in a few months after leaving government, and I felt like it was quite a cathartic process, because I got to get quite a lot of things off my chest having been in government and in different departments, both in central government, number 10, health department, home office, that sort of thing. And there's some amazing people doing some fantastic things, but they're often fighting against the structures within which they operate. And so if we just look particularly at the sort of emerging technologies, and obviously there's much more within the industrial strategy piece, but just within emerging technologies, as I mentioned earlier, the government's change to add in a whole new science and tech department, very welcome, because not only is it helping to, I guess, get a bit of firepower behind having a whole department focused on this. You've got Secretary of State who will bang the table at the at the cabinet table to sort of make the case for science and technology. That sort of stuff is important, but there's lots of other structural things that government has attempted, but I don't know how much they've actually been implemented. So there's the creation of the National Science and Technology Council, which was PM chaired. It was created a few years ago. Really important, at least potential to be important thing in order to basically try and get different parts of government to deliver on this science and technology, because so much of it is in different departments. You've got to have coordination across Treasury, from DBT now, etc. But that, with the power behind it, with the PM, could be really effective. And it's meant to, the science and technology framework said that it was now meeting monthly, and I read that and I was like, fantastic. And then I sat down with officials 6 months later and I was like, right, how many times has it met? And they were like, not as often. And it turns out that it's met, I think, maybe 3 or 4 times, and that was more than a year ago since DSIT was created. So there's lots of things that need to happen in order to try and get better coordinated. Fundamentally, that takes political power, and the sort of people there being like, this has to happen. The PM is rightly very enthused about AI, and that's great. And there's lots of progress that has been made on that, but there are other technologies, and we need to see the sort of same focus from them and from any future governments as well, in order to understand the importance of this, both to security and prosperity for the UK.
And to ask the political point, do you have the sense that that Labour in opposition are gearing themselves up for that kind of really focused approach, or do you think jury's still out on that one?
Potentially. I don't know how, if Keir is as enthused about AI as Rishi is, but that's one specific technology. But I think that there's some good signs, but I think there's lots left to uncover before now in the election.
Nicola, do you think that Labour would be ready for the sort of institutional challenge of getting government really focused around delivering on some very specific objectives?
I mean, I can't speak for the Labour Party, but I know there was a review recently which was undertaken by, I think it was Ian Anderson, senior businessman, which was commissioned for a Labour Shadow Minister, looking very much at the way that government engages with business and with unions and how to do that in a more meaningful way. And I don't think there's much in the recommendations of that report that people here would disagree with, in terms of having to have proper delegated decision making, clearer, all these committees that have been set up that meet six times a year and provide photo opportunities, actually becoming meaningful decision making structures that then have impact on policy making. And trying to set clearer, longer-term strategic directions. So I think there is commitment to do that, and I think that there is evidence from government that it can, right? If you look across other areas of social policy, look at the Low Pay Commission. That's a tripartite commission of trade unionists, senior employers, academics, and over a course of 20 years, it's been given a clear job to set a minimum wage, and it has done it across the country. So I'm not suggesting, there is the Committee on Climate Change, possibly less successful, but still a collaborative way of working, of setting a long-term direction, of holding government to account. So it's possible to set up structures that stand the test of time and actually take a mission and deliver it in terms of real policy. And I think we need to keep hold of that, but we also need to keep hold of the fact that change happens, and that isn't just driven by government, but government can actively shape the direction in which it goes in. Again, if you look at the Low Pay Commission, if it hadn't existed, we wouldn't have, we probably would still have people in this country on the sort of jobs that I used to do as a teenager on £2 an hour. So that has been an active example of a piece of policy making which has made a very dramatic difference to low-wage people's experience of the jobs market in this country, that wouldn't just have happened, whatever change we might have seen in the wider economy. So I think there's an opportunity, and we need to keep hold of the fact that while it's difficult, there are ways through. And if you look at other countries, across all sorts of other European countries, there is formal duties to engage with business and unions equitably when developing this sort of legislation. There's legislative frameworks that automatically build in certain consultation, and crucially there's stronger frameworks for collective bargaining, so that you don't pretend it's all in government's hand. That at the workplace level, you make sure that there's the regulatory framework in place, so these conversations and discussions are happening across every single place of work.
Thank you. Now, apologies, I've let time slightly run away from us, but we do have time perhaps for one round of questions. So I don't know, are there any burning questions in the audience? Let's see. In that case, look, let's... oh, is there a question there?
I think there's
There is. There we go. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. So I think, Asif, this is one directed towards you. You said there needs to be a role in bringing together design and manufacturing into one single connected discipline. Are you able to spell out a little bit more what that might look like? I'm thinking from a semiconductor capacity, but it doesn't have to be just semiconductors.
Okay, so I think if you've got to go back quite a few years and kind of look at the product development process, the product development process took place in several very linear stages. You had a stage where somebody would come up with a concept, and it would be passed to an engineering team who'd engineer it, passed to a production team who'd make it, then passed to a distribution team, and that was, if you like, the value chain. And what we've seen happening over the years is a convergence of all those kind of disciplines into one. Because of the amount of pressure that we're under, consumer pressure, pressures on productivity, pressures on cost, it's kind of forced designers to have to know as much about manufacturing as manufacturers do, and it's had to force manufacturers to know much about designers as the design and engineering team do. So what we're seeing is kind of a collaborative environment where if you start laying down geometry for a model or something like that, it'll give you the manufacturing information up front. If I make this glass in this way, what are my production costs? If cost is no issue and I just want to make one of them and the glass is going to cost £10,000, I'd make certain decisions on how way I'd make it. But if cost is an issue and I've only got 50p per unit cost, I'd make other manufacturing decisions. So design and manufacturing merging into one is the ability for those two teams to sit down and kind of just make those decisions digitally, virtually, before you've cut any particular material, before you've allocated a supply chain or purchased any material or metal or anything like that, so you can then serve the need of the customer or your market more effectively. So that's just kind of one example of design and manufacturing are literally becoming the same thing. As we're meeting engineers, they know as much about production now as a lot of our production operatives. As we're meeting production people, although they don't like it that much, everything's the engineer's fault because, they've designed it wrong, you can't make it that way. All these little friction points between various stages inside the value chain is an opportunity that digital technology, could eradicate those or eliminate those friction points. So that's an example of what I mean, those two disciplines coming. So when we're seeing the same with manufacturing and construction, industrialized construction is very similar to manufacturing these days. So there's this convergence of disciplines, ideas, departments, levels of expertise, and this is what's creating this kind of like this new breed of engineering and design. Did that answer the question? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have, I'm afraid, run out of time for this session. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I think coming into the room, we all sort of broadly agreed that industrial strategy broadly was a useful and good thing. But I think through the course of discussion, we also realised just how complicated the process can be of actually either defining or setting out an industrial strategy, and certainly of executing an industrial strategy across government. But I'd like to thank all of my panellists for a fascinating discussion. We are about to segue, I think, into another sort of highly relevant and related subject matter, which is talking about what is Britain's role in a more complex and uncertain world, where we'll be talking about a world of greater power competition and fast technological change. So sort of two sides of the same coin, I think, very much. But if you'd like to join me in thanking our panellists for listening.